Starliner Media. Starliner Media presents Music Night at the Majestic with your host, Michael Boswell.
All right, it's time once again for Music Night at the Majestic, and with us tonight, Walter Egan. Walter, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here. How are you today?
Well, so far so good.
Good.
I'll tell you, I find you to be a really interesting guy, Walter, because I always find it interesting when creative people have outlets in multiple forms, and for you, singer, songwriter, guitar player, also sculptor, painter, all those things.
Yeah.
So,
to me, when you start to realize living the creative life, it's hard not to want to express yourself in other forms of it, and I came from a family where my parents were kind of living the Mad Men life from that TV show. My mother was the copy director, and my stepfather was the art director for an advertising company in New York City. And so, me being an only child, I was encouraged to be creative, I guess, and at least, if not encouraged, I kind of followed their example that way. Not so much with the martinis, but with the, I thought a good way to catch my mother's attention would be to be creative about things. And so, yeah, I was fairly well encouraged to do that. And as I've gone along, I've found, trying to live the Renaissance man life is not such a bad way to go. It kind of confuses people sometimes, even within, the songwriting spectrum or the musical spectrum, I guess you might say, because, people know me for Magnet and Steel, of course, and that the mainstream albums, pop rock kind of things that I've done. But of course, I've been in the surf band, the Malibus, and I've been in country rock bands, the Burritos and the Brooklyn Cowboys. And I've even been in a doo-wop band when I was living in New York in the early 90s. I got to be a guitarist with Randy and the Rainbows. And you might be old enough to remember the song Denise. That was,
absolutely.
I think technically might have been the last doo-wop song to crack the top 10. And so, it's a satisfying thing for me to be able to exercise all those kind of desires that I have for those things. And, I started trying to write screenplays probably maybe 20 years ago now. And I've written 3 autobiographical screenplays, or more or less autobiographical. And then I adapted a book called Health Agent, which is written by a guy named Jeffrey Thomas. Jeffrey got in touch with me via the internet and asked if he could have permission to use the lyrics to one of my songs, a song of mine called Tunnel of Love, which my most salacious song, I guess. And I said, of course, yeah, you certainly can. And he had made a name for himself with a series of books about a place called Punktown. And Punktown is a city on a planet much like Earth, much like slightly in the future where, alien life forms all interact and live together and are some strange and very creative elements that he brings to his books. And so I said, yeah, sure. And then he asked if I wanted to be a character in that story. And then I said, well, of course, why not? And, so he wrote a story called Waltered States, which has me visiting this hot singing duo within the universe, this universe of his. And it's the name of the duo is called Rake and Widget, and one of them is kind of like a tall, lanky cowboy, and the other one is a 3 foot tall marionette type, floating marionette that is alive, but is taking the form of a marionette, and he's very ill-tempered, and he and I get into this big discussion and disagreement about things, and he starts cursing me out, and it's a really clever and funny book. It's within so that story is included in a collection called Nocturnal Emissions, which is not necessarily endemic of what it is, but it's a funny kind of way that things kind of dovetail, and creativity leads to other creativities, and through the early years of trying to be a musician, I tried being a flautist, a flute player. I never took keyboard lessons, but I kind of taught myself enough to play organ on some of my home recordings, and I think once you realize what expressing yourself through creativity can feel like and can do for you, and enriching your life, I think is really what it comes down to. And so I just noticed you have the Kingston Trio at the Hungry Eye album behind there. That was one of my favorite albums when I was growing up.
It's a great album.
It is. And, that was when Dave Guard was in the band, and Dave was my favorite one. He kind of had that kind of California hipness that appealed to me growing up in Queens, New York. But,
yeah. Well, tell me this, Walter. All the mediums that you've worked in, which was the one that you gravitated to first?
Oh, well, on Christmas Eve, and when I was, I guess, a sophomore in high school, I grew up a Catholic, and I was at midnight mass, and I was inspired to write a poem that night, as observing people not necessarily paying attention to what was going on in the service. And so I guess poetry might be the first, but shortly thereafter, I started writing songs. I got a guitar when I was 15. And I told my parents I didn't want lessons. For some reason, I thought I was going to teach myself how to do this. And ultimately, I kind of did. I mean, I picked it up watching Friends and things, but I had a Kingston Trio songbook. And that is how I taught myself the shapes of the chords. And I spent that summer kind of practicing that.
What was your favorite Kingston Trio song or songs?
Oh, wow. Well, I guess Coast of California was one of my big favorites. It still is, as a matter of fact. I still listen to them when I can. The Mission of San Miguel was another one that I loved a lot. Bandua, Bandua, Bandua. Oh. Some of the ones they would do in sort of Polynesian. I always liked those a lot. There was a Calypso song about finding a watch in this. A fella lost a watch at his railroad station, and what a confusion! Fella lost a watch at the railroad station. An attractive girl named Melda was accused of being a burglar. She had no personal pocket in her clothes, and no where she had the watch, only goodness knows. And you're hearing tick, tick, tick. Everybody looking, tick, tick, tick. See them all a-searching, tick, tick, tick. That's all you hear, but you couldn't find out where the watch was hiding. That was one of my favorites.
Well, what I always liked was the fact that you touched on it, is the fact that they incorporated so many other sounds than traditional folk in it, in their work.
They did, and I think they were perceived as maybe a little white bread and not true folk and that kind of thing, kind of commercialized, but they were great. their voices blended so well, and they brought such great energy to their performances. I got to see them when I was that first summer when I had the guitar when I was 15. I got to see them. Grew up in Forest Hills, Queens, and their tennis stadium there. I got to see them there. Also saw the Beatles there, which was another thrill. But
what do you remember about that Beatles show?
Oh, wow. Well, I remember how short it was. I actually got to see them 3 times. I saw them at Carnegie Hall, where the emphasis is on seeing them because the screams made it almost impossible to hear anything but the bass, which was kind of, made for like a mystery. You had to, okay, what song is this? I think I know what that bass line is. And then they would calm down just long enough at the end of the song for them to say 1 or 2 words, and the girls would start screaming again. It was quite a remarkable experience, just being there at that beginning of all that craziness that was so new to all of us, and so it was. I was, I grew up in that era there. I was born in 1948, and so we all had that shared, depressing thing with Kennedy being killed. And when the Beatles came along, it really lifted our spirits, I think, in a lot of ways. Just their energy and their cheekiness and the way they kind of reinvented rock and roll for us. Because, rock and roll had gone through a corporatization of, kind of watering down the hard edges that Elvis and Jerry Lee and Little Richard and Chuck Berry had initially brought to it, and then then it became Fabian and just kind of
what Rick Nelson referred to as the shiny teeth guys.
Yes, the shiny teeth guys. That's perfect. So yeah, and the Beatles. Everything like that has become so formalized as a cliche almost because of the media and and all the things that happen. That movie 8 Days a Week, I thought, captured a little bit of that kind of spirit, because my daughter's 26, and she was going through that same kind of fan thing with One Direction around that time. And I was like, you should, if you could only have experienced this as it was, that, and of course, I guess people can say, well, Frank Sinatra had that too and everything. But of course, for our generation, there was Elvis, and then there was the Beatles. And I was a little too young for Elvis, although I got the idea. I was, 8 when he was on Ed Sullivan. And I felt some chills. I was like, what's this? This is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
This is just something that's just in front of me. And I had a friend where I lived close to where the doctor who had delivered me lived. And his son, Claude, was, I think, maybe might have been 2 years older than me, but at least a year older than I was. And he had the ducktail, and he looked like the Elvis kind of, Fabian kind of person. But he was my personal Elvis, and so, he kind of, led me into rock and roll that way when I was very young. But yeah, the screams of the Carnegie Hall show are what I remember, and of the show in Forest Hills, I remember that they what was the guy's name that did Haunted House? I just moved in a new house today. Blue Miller was his name, maybe. Jumpin' Gene Miller or something like that.
Jumpin' Gene Simmons.
Jumpin' Gene Simmons, that's who it was, yeah. And he was on the show as well. I think, they padded the show because, the Beatles only played for half an hour in those days. And then I saw them at Shea Stadium So I'm actually technically in that movie.
But you didn't get a credit though, did you?
No, but I was about 10 rows from the top of the stadium at Shea Stadium, and outrageously the ticket cost $5.50 to be able to sit there. And in those days that seemed like an exorbitant amount of money. And funnily I did this show. It was called the Rock Con. It was a kind of a convention yard sale for rockers at the Sheridan at the Meadowlands up outside New York. And I got to meet Sid Bernstein, the promoter of that show. And he was such a character. He was just a really funny little guy, and very personable. And shook his hand and everything. And I said, we just thought those tickets were very overpriced for that Beatles show. And he took his wallet out and he said, well, here, let me give it back to you. I was like, no, that's okay. But thank you. Thanks just the same. It's been quite a life for me in being able to do a lot of the music and meet a lot of the people that I've admired through the years. Some have called me the Forrest Gump of rock and roll. But yeah.
Well, I mean, you have crossed paths with an amazing list of folks.
Well, when you live long enough, I guess, and you keep wanting to move in that direction, it starts to accrue there. And
yeah. Well, to tell you mentioned that, Walter. One of those people would be Linda Ronstadt.
Yes.
How did you guys cross paths to begin with?
She was hungry one night. And I think if she hadn't been hungry for dinner that night, my life would have been a different story. I have just reviewed that and kind of have been writing about it. She was about to do a show at the Cellar Door, which is was at that time one of the premier kind of showcase clubs in a circuit that included, I guess, the Bitter End or the Bottom Line in New York, and Paul's Mall or something, maybe up in Boston. Anyway, and acts that were just kind of making it would come and play maybe a whole week or at least 6 nights. And so she was about to do that at the Cellar Door. This was December of 1970. And my band, which was called Sageworth, had just embarked after I graduated in 1970 from Georgetown. And so we had just started becoming a local favorite, actually, in the Georgetown, DC area. And we were playing at a bar across the street called Apple Pie. And it was a crazy Sunday night, which, we did regularly. So we had a good crowd there that night that were getting into us. And Linda and her band were hungry after having set up their equipment over at the Cellar Door across the street. They popped in. They kind of liked what they were hearing through the walls, and sat down, had dinner, and invited us to come and meet her after our set. And that, of course, thrilled us because we loved Linda's music. And at the time, we were moving into a kind of a country rock band. I had been a Big Birds and Buffalo Springfield fan, and that was incorporated in my writing. We were doing original material as well as maybe half original, half covers. And we had a wonderful girl singer named Annie McClune. Annie would adapt the Jefferson Airplane songs and Janis Joplin. And so we had this kind of amalgamation of LA and San Francisco West Coast sounds. And but I was a big Burritos fan, the Flying Burrito Brothers, after I realized who Graham Parsons was, after he hijacked the Byrds, being that psychedelic band with 8 Miles High, and then all of a sudden they were doing Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which kind of took us by surprise. Because, the late 60s, hippies and country music fan rednecks weren't necessarily hanging out very much together. It was a very radical thing, much more so than people realize because of the, I guess you could see the polarization recently in our country, but it was a very polarized time in those days too. And so it was a bold move for them to embrace real traditional country music without tongues in cheeks, I think,
Right.
And so, yeah, we were following that path. And so we had those kinds of songs in our set. And Linda was one of our favorites. We were looking forward to seeing her at the club that week anyway. And so she couldn't have been nicer. She and Annie hit it off real well. And the players that she had at that point was Gib Gilbo and Thad Maxwell, and they had been a band called Swamp Water and had an album out on their own. And so this was, the opening up of that golden land of LA to us, because we aspired to be there, except, we weren't sure exactly how to make that happen. And so, and that night, her tour manager, also someone who played fiddle and mandolin and some guitar with her, was a guy named Chris Darrow.
Mm-hmm.
And Chris expressed a real interest in our band, saying that he wanted to produce us for this production company that he worked for at the time, which actually happened to be Sergio Mendes production company. And so we hung out that week and got to know one another more and more. And I continued that contact with Chris. They offered us a contract over the next year or so. It fell apart because they wanted all our publishing and we weren't ready to give them all the publishing, but I stayed in touch with Chris. And in 73, when Linda was opening for the Beach Boys at the Madison Square Garden show in New York, I drove her in my in the band's beat up white Econoline van to the show, down under Madison Square Garden, and got to hang out with her there. And she was like, if you do move to California, you should come and play with my band. I'm not sure I'm happy with my guitar player right now. And that was like, okay, here's a good to go. And over the next period of a couple of months, the band, our band broke up. Sageworth finally broke up because, we had been teased into a few deals that never quite happened. And then there's recrimination that happens between the members of the band. It's like, well, it's your fault. It was your song. Oh, it's not my fault. And so ultimately the band, which had really lived that dream of living together, working together 24 hours a day. Annie and I got very, very close to one another for a while as well, which is a whole other aspect of being a musician as to, well, it's better to be with a woman who is doing the same thing you are, or someone who has nothing to do with what you do, and having tried both sides, my answer is, I don't know. When it's good either way, that's the thing. And so when it was good with Annie, it was great. And then it just got to be, well, maybe it'd be better if we played with other people for a while. And that ultimately happened. Annie got her own deal. She put out an album on RCA called Fast Annie. And I followed Chris's siren call to the West Coast. And I moved out there, and it just so happens that first week that I was in California, he had been planning to do this tour behind his second album in England. Well, the English company withdrew their tour support, so he couldn't bring his band with him. There I am sitting on his couch playing one of his guitars, and he said, "Do you want to be my band?" It's like, well, sure. I just left everything behind to move to California, but sure, let's go to England. Why not? So for a month, I went to England with him, and we opened, I guess it was about 18 dates, 20 dates for a band called the Man Band, which were a really great band out of Wales. They were kind of the Welsh Grateful Dead. And it was through that tour that I got to meet his English A&R man, a guy named Andrew Lauder. And it was Andrew who 2 years later would see me and my band in LA, wind up offering me the deal instead of my band. And that was the beginning of, as they say, the rest is history, part of my life.
Well, your first album that you mentioned, you end up having some pretty well-known folks involved in that one too. How did that whole situation come to be?
Well, it was really funny because Fleetwood Mac, to me, was a blues band. I had some of the Peter Green 45s from England and Black Magic Woman and those things. I loved them. I was on the radio at Georgetown, so I used to play that stuff on the radio. And then the next time I had any, idea what Fleetwood Mac was doing was on I think it was the In Concert program that used to be on Friday nights on TV. And they did a song called The Bermuda Triangle. And this was when Bob Welch was in the band. And that was kind of a weird blues psychedelic thing. And by the time I was ready to do my first album, I was not in that headspace. So when, okay, and then the fact that they even came into the picture happened because Chris Darrow had dealings with a guy named Greg Lewick at United Artists in LA. Greg took a liking to the band that I was putting together out there and became involved with it. He suggested we do some demos with an engineer named Dwayne Scott. And Dwayne worked at a studio called Sound City, which was in the lovely town of Van Nuys, California. Yes, in the shadow of Busch Gardens, as it was in those days. And it was a funky studio, but it was a fun studio to be in. It had a great big Studio A room. And we cut, I guess, maybe 6 or 7 tunes out there with Dwayne. And because he had been working there, he got to know Buckingham Nicks, who had recorded not only the Buckingham Nicks album there with Keith Olsen, but also had just done that, what they call the White Album,
right?
The first Fleetwood Mac album. So when I had that deal offered to me in February of '76 from the UA UK guy, I was ready, let's get Todd Rundgren to produce it. Let's get Brian Wilson. Let's get Carl Wilson. Let's get John Fogerty. These were the producers that came to mind for me. None of which seemed to work out in the scheme of things at that time. And then it was like, well, let's get Fleetwood Mac's producers. And it was like, Fleetwood Mac, but that's not what I'm doing. I don't know. And they handed me the Buckingham Nicks album, and it was like, oh, that's pretty good. And then, of course, the first Fleetwood Mac album, which was more to the point, which had less kind of orchestration that Keith Olsen had added for Buckingham Nicks. But it started to make sense to me. And it was around March of 1976 that they agreed to do the project, with the stipulation that they had to work around the Fleetwood Mac schedule. But the fact was that Stevie and Lindsey wanted to keep that Buckingham Nicks identity alive outside of Fleetwood Mac at that point anyway. So it was just, lucky that Linda wanted dinner, lucky that Chris was with Linda, lucky that Chris invited me to stay with him. It's funny how you never know what's behind the next door that you're about to go through. And so, I met Lindsey, and his influence was Kingston Trio, Beach Boys. And of course, my middle name is Lindsey, which who knows what that means. And Stevie, of course, kind of knocked my socks off as far as I loved her voice and her whole presence. I saw them for the first time at a show in Santa Barbara in April of '76, and it was a daytime concert, but they still, really were amazing. Lindsey's playing was great, and Stevie got enough of her Welsh witch chiffon stuff going on that day that I was quite intrigued by her as well. Turned out that her birthday fell within like a couple of weeks of Annie McClune's birthday. And as I got to know them, their band Fritz, which grew into Buckingham Nicks, was very similar to my band Sageworth. And so, Lindsey and I began to see that we had all these parallels in common, and it all started feeling really good. And of course, I was happy that they appreciated the songs that I brought to the project. And but the weird part about that was I was always in bands where I was the songwriter and lead guitarist, and yet I wasn't really the lead singer. I would sing an oldie or something every now and then, but I was always convinced that everyone else could sing better than I could. So when this deal was offered me, it was like, wait, you mean you want me to sing in these songs? And I was like, yeah, we do. I was like, oh, okay. Because at that Hoot Night at the Troubadour where Andrew saw us play, the songs, 5 out of the 6 songs were songs I had written, but I only sang one of them. And, I was kind of surprised when they offered the deal just to me. And so, yeah, I had a lot of confidence to build as far as what I was doing. And so having people that I came to respect very much on my side and in my band technically for the recording sessions just, really helped me get over that and start to be able to feel secure enough to get beyond, am I singing the right note, to be able to sing a little bit better about things. And, and I still don't love listening to myself sing, but I love doing it. I really enjoyed being a singer. So it's a funny thing, but doing what we do in this business is a little complicated, I think, as far as people that I've met. I mean, even Stevie and even Linda, especially Linda, the insecurity that is kind of hiding within us, that somehow we get over and put this bold front on when we're up on stage. It's a fact of life, I guess, and it is curious, you might say.
Yeah, I've had a number of stand-up comics tell me the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think shy people are able to somehow break through that within the confines of being on stage and doing that. And of course, that translates to, I feel better playing for a lot of people than I do than in a room where 4 people are in the front row and I'm like, oh, hello. It's something you never really get over, even though you do it and you've done it. And yet there are times being on stage where you get that feeling like they're going to see through the fact that I'm just doing this. It's just fun for me. And you got to know that I'm because you never feel like you're equal to the people who've inspired you to be doing it, I think. And so I'm sure, even John Lennon had his own insecurities on stage that he was able to conquer and get over. And the people who were able to do it and to translate and to be that kind of always on showbiz person off stage, that's a whole other world that those people that I meet, it's like, oh, you're so different when you're on stage. And you're like, yes, well, that's part of the package.
Well, tell me this, as we're talking about those first 2 records that you did. What was the first time you heard one of your songs on the radio?
I was living out in the great Inland Empire, as they call it, east of LA, just around Claremont and Pomona and Upland. And I was at the drive-through line at the McDonald's, at that Pomona McDonald's. And KLOS, I think, was the station, or it might have been KMET, played Only the Lucky from my first album, which was actually my first single. And that was quite a thrill to hear that. And it was tempered by the fact that it was back announced as Only the Lonely by the DJ. So I was like, oh, okay.
Were you screaming, no, no?
But this is my record. Yeah, this is the, I think I heard my grandmother's voice in my head at that point of, never get too full of yourself kind of thing. It was like, yeah, okay. And of course, I loved that Only the Lonely by Roy Orbison anyway. So if they had to mistake it for any song, that was all right.
You could do worse, Walter.
Yeah, but it was great. I mean, the fact that you build a material, a repertoire of all these songs that I had been writing from the time I was 16 until, I had been writing songs for maybe 12 years when I went in to record my first album. So I had quite a stockpile of tunes that to pick from. And some of that carried over into the next album, of course. But yeah, there were a lot of realizations when you do your first album. You think you've made it, and in reality, you're just at the next plateau where now you're up against all these other people who have made it, and now the next step is to get noticed and see if you can have a hit song. And and the fact that the deal that started with United Artists in England as a 3 singles deal, really, it was like 6 sides. Once Stevie and Lindsey got into the package, that became an album, and then that became something of interest to other people. And my manager, Greg Lewick, had the partnership with a guy named David Krebs, who was of a company called Lieber Krebs, and they were the managers of Aerosmith. And he said, we can make a deal at Columbia. Let me do that. And so he ran with it, and then it suddenly turned into a 6-album deal at the Columbia, which was a huge label, of course, and had some good people on it through the years. And so, suddenly the doors that would never have opened, everyone that I was trying to knock down for 5 years, 6 years, were suddenly opening. It was like, wow, this is interesting how all of a sudden, and, we were there from the beginning. We loved you all the time. And it's like, okay, well, thanks for that.
We've been following you since the World's Fair in '65.
That's great that you know about that. Yeah, that was a thrill too. But the evolution of that deal and how it happened. Of course, I can't discount the impact that Stevie and Lindsey had on that. Even though at the time they were just kind of emerging on their own. But their talent shone through, and Lindsey was such a student of record production, as I had kind of been, being a Brian Wilson fan and kind of paying attention to what he had done through those golden years. And that was, of course, something that we talked about a lot. And as we approached doing the second album, it was a little different because technically the production team for the first album was that engineer who put the deal together, Dwayne Scott, myself, Stevie and Lindsey. But Stevie and Lindsey weren't always getting along so well in those days, and so ultimately the diplomacy that I had to show between them, because I loved both of them, but I didn't, anyway. So ultimately it worked out that, Lindsey would kind of more or less come in during the days and work with the band, with the arrangements and that at the beginning, then transferred over to Stevie, working with vocals and working with vocal arrangements and things. And then they were both kind of around for the mix, but Lindsey more than Stevie, and sometimes it got a little uncomfortable when they obviously had not been having a good day together when they'd arrive and things. And so, but, and of
It
course,
happens.
yeah. And of course, then I had that uncomfortable position of really wanting to see about taking Stevie out if they weren't going to be together. And so I pursued that on that level. And for about a month at the end of 76, I was able to kind of work my way in between Lindsey and Don Henley and her social calendar and have a few wonderful nights that, I often think it's like, she's a chapter in my book, but I'm like a footnote in hers. But, still, I know what happened and I remember what happened. And I've got the notes to prove it because I was keeping a journal at that time, too. So, and that's another thing in writing this autobiography that I'm trying to do. It's like, well, how much am I going to tell about really intimate things that happen between myself and my friends? And I don't know yet. I'm sort of working that out as I go along, I guess. But, I tend to err on the side of implication rather than total description of things, I think.
Yeah, probably for the best.
Well, I think so, too, even though looking at it crassly, I suppose the thing that sells books are the dirty details that I'm just not ready to go with, I mean, for example, Graham Parsons, as he hijacked the Byrds, became Flying Burrito Brothers and became a person of interest to me as far as someone who was doing really good music and what the heck was going on with him. Finally getting to know him was a great thing for me, but I got to see him in his most charming days and also in his sort of most depressing vortex of whatever demon he was fighting at the time. When he and Emmylou started singing together, the first time they sang together was in the kitchen of the house where I was living, and I was the only one there to hear this amazing moment. So that taught me a lesson as far as people who create music, anything, I suppose. The people who do that have a certain thing that they've given you with that creation. But when you follow it through to their personal lives, it doesn't always jive, it's like, well, it's really depressing. Why are you doing that to yourself, Graham? Because you have so much to give. And it's like, you really don't understand where it's all going and coming from.
Well, how did Hearts on Fire? How did Graham come to record that?
Yeah, well, I had, as I said, that when they first got together, was in the kitchen, and I got to know him a little bit, and Emmylou got to know him too, and realized this is going to be a good move for her. Around that same time, there was a band called Asleep at the Wheel that used to play in the same clubs in Georgetown that we did. And Ray Benson, the great lead guitar player and lead singer for that band, was a friend of ours, and he used to come over to the house and visit. And he was doing that one day, not long after Graham had been there, and kind of nudged me away from, well, country music should be kind of tongue in cheek, and it should be like Ringo singing it in the Beatles, that kind of thing, to kind of trying to take it seriously. Well, was teaching me a guitar lick, which covers like 4 octaves, and it's just a way of ending a country song. And I had spent a few hours with him that afternoon doing that. And once he left, for whatever reason, I just started, as songs do, I started playing some chords that I've played a million times yet. This day, these chords sounded like something I should follow. And sure enough, Hearts on Fire kind of came out of that moment at the house in Georgetown. And the band Sageworth, we played that for, a few months with the lyrics that I wrote it with, which were not quite as serious as the ones that Graham and Emmy sang. Tom Geiderer, who was our bass player, recognized that the song might have good potential and said, well, why don't you change those lines that sound a little kind of cheeky and a little more serious? And so I did that, and Emmylou heard it and she liked it, and she brought it out to Graham as they were recording the GP album. And Graham said he wanted to do it. And so that was quite a thrill for me. Of course, my last idol in the music business, actually cutting a song that I had written. To me, it was like, how could it get any better than this? If because there was no real reason why I should think that I'd be able to have a career in the music business. There was nothing out of my past life with my family certainly had any kind of musical band. My twin cousin, we were born 15 minutes apart, the same doctor, the same hospital, Jim Honeycutt. He was in a band called The Repairs that made a couple of albums with the Rolling Stones producer, Andrew Loog Oldham, which is kind of funny. They were kind of a new Christy Minstrels band, and yet he produced them. So that was
That is an interesting mix.
Yeah, it was. And, sometimes interesting mixes make success. But
Emmylou recorded with Daniel Lanois, so I mean, it's
That's right. That was one of the great albums that she did.
Yeah, Wrecking Ball.
Yeah. So anyway, I didn't have any real reason to think that I could make it in music, but this was kind of attaining something that I found quite amazing, that he would do this song. And then when they were on tour behind the GP album, they came through Boston, and that's when I got to chauffeur him around in that same famous Econoline van that Linda had ridden in. And that was when, going to the show, he was still pretty good, happy kind of frame of mind. But after doing a couple of sets at this club called Oliver's, which I think had a lot to do with his frame of mind, because our band played there for a week, and the psychic scars took a long time to get over. I think that was part of that wedge that eventually made us break up. But yeah, he was not in a real happy place after those shows. But amazingly, someone had recorded the night that he played, well, the first time for us anyway, Hearts on Fire. We were all in the audience, and he singled out Sageworth, and that recording someone posted online, and I was able to download it. So I actually had that moment when he played that song. It's an amazing. It's a real thrill for me for that to happen, and it's a funny way to get into being a pop rocker by having that song, but that was my calling card when I moved to LA the following year, and wound up playing with a guy named Rob Strandlin, whose calling card was having co-authored Already Gone by the Eagles. And he was trying to get a country deal, and I was trying to get a pop deal. And I had it was a kind of funny crossroads of influences going on there. But yeah, it's been an amazing rock and roller coaster for me.
Yeah.
this
Well, I
life.
tell you, we got to the first album. We'd be remiss if we don't talk about the second album, since that one obviously has
That's the one,
the
yes.
classic track, Magnet and Steel.
Well, it's got a couple of classic tracks actually, but yeah, Magnet and Steel especially. And it was written during the recording of the first album when Stevie was doing background vocals for one of my songs. That song I mentioned earlier, that Tunnel of Love song. She does this wailing banshee crazy stuff that she was into singing that. And I was quite moved by that performance. On my way home to Pomona that night, it was like 4:30 in the morning. We got on the 101 freeway going east, and a car pulled in front of me. And it was the kind of car we used to call the pimp mobile. It was like a lowered Lincoln Continental with a diamond window in the back and lighting underneath it, the whole deal. It was really, really pimped out, as they say. And I noticed the license plate said "Not Shy," and for some reason I took that as a message. I often do that. If you're in a supermarket and you're just walking around and someone has taken something and decided not to buy it, but put it out of place somewhere on the. Many times I'll look at that and I'll go, that might be something good. So that's the kind of person I am. I look for things like that. These.
I'm with you.
Irrational signs from the universe. Anyway, so I took that Not Shy thing. I had been working on a song to bring back that 50s feel. The Stroll is the name of that beat, and it's that, and back when I was 10 years old, there was a hit called The Stroll. And, people, Soul Train has that same dance where guys on one side, girls on the other, and one couple dances down the middle. That was The Stroll. Anyway, then I just couldn't help but feel unavoidably attracted to Stevie at that point. And it all came together on, 30 minutes of work when I got home. And so that song, it was a very sincere recreation of that feel, but of course of my emotions for her. That second verse, "You're a woman who's lost to her song." I realized that my little tryst with Stevie wasn't going to carry over as we finished that first album. And so, I think Lindsey knew it was about her. But when we did that second album, Stevie had become just a cameo performer on the album rather than part of the production team. And Lindsey was very much in charge, along with me and Richard Dashett, who was the engineer on that second album. Anyway, so it's funny because it stuck out like a sore thumb in that album, because I think of myself as a rocker, and then maybe one other ballad on that album, but it's very much up tempo. Let's rock. That was the kind of attitude that I had. But because of it, people would hear the album and then they always go, "Oh, let's play that one again." And okay, whatever works. So that's how it stood out. But also in the recording of that second album, okay, well, my obsession with Stevie carried over into a number of ways. On my tour behind the Fundamental Role album, I had been playing one of her songs, a song called "Sisters of the Moon," which she played for me one night, telling me that Fleetwood Mac didn't want to do it. And I said, "Well, I think that's a great song. I'll do it." And so I learned it as "Sister of the Moon" and worked it up with my band. And we played it, quite a bit on that first tour. So we were ready when it came to recording the second album to record that as the kind of climax of the album. In those days, the thing had two sides, and the end of the second side was always supposed to be the big finish. And it was that kind of song. It was a very strong song, actually. So when we were running it down in that big Studio A at Sound City, and Lindsey came out and he was like, what is this? What are you playing? You know, what's going on here? And I said, well, you know, I always liked this song of Stevie's, and, you know, trying to get some points with her, or whatever. No, I didn't say that, but, you know, he understood what was going on. And he was like, you know, I don't think that's a good idea. I think you need to go home and write a song to close this album. And, you know, and that's no easy task to just come up with a closing song for an album. But that night, it was the middle of August, and I started thinking about the good feeling I had about being in Sageworth when we were all living the dream, kind of, as they say, living the day in rock and roll and playing every night and doing it all together. And even in high school with the Malibus, where summertime had that feel because we could, you know, devote so much time to the music.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I started playing 3 chords and came up with the song Hot Summer Nights. And the next morning I played it for the band and for Linz, and he was like, yeah, that's a good one. Let's do it. So the original recording on the album is a little slower than it evolved to be because it's become really the closing song for most every set I play. Because amazingly, this song was the most covered song I'd ever written. It went on to be covered, well, by the group Night, who had the hit with it in 1979, of course. But there was a French version, there's a Swedish version, a German version, Japanese version. I mean, it's crazy to me because it was such a personal song to me about just being in a band, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's the wordless hook, the ooh kind of hook that catches people on it. So, you know, the moral of that story is when Lindsey tells you to go write a song, you better go write it. It's pretty amazing. And then, of course, the epilogue to that story is in 2009, Eminem used that song for his song We Made You. And that came out of left field. And I really got to hand it to him and his management or whoever that got in touch with me about using the song. Because if you listen to the song We Made You, you might not immediately jump to my version of Hot Summer Night.
Yeah.
Even the cover.
That's Walter.
Yeah, and it's so funny but I guess there was some meaningful litigation that had happened about samples and things prior to that. And so they were very upfront about it. Of course, I'm not sure how it took 5 people to write that song of theirs, but there's 5 writers listed, and I'm one of the ones, and it says it's an interpolation of Summer Nights. I'm not sure what that word means.
What was your first take when you heard Eminem's take on it?
Well, of course, they had to play it for me before they released it because I had to give the approval, and they were worried about sending me an MP3 that I might leak it to the world when people were doing Napster and stuff, I guess. And so they played it for me over the phone. And just to make sure, I took my little cassette recorder and I put it up. And so I held it up there as they played it for me. And the first thought I had was, they've got the wrong person. It must be somebody else's song. This isn't. I expected it to be the hook, the guitar hook, or the ooh, or the needle. You know, I expected a needle drop of some sort. And eventually I realized that it was the right chord pattern and kind of the right feel. And I also realized it was in the key of the cover version of Night's version. So they were taking it from that album. And I was like, well, yeah, that's great. It's subtle, but it's pretty cool.
Uh-huh.
You know, and so I had to negotiate what percentage I would get out of it. And it was an amazing kick in the butt for my publishing and my writer's royalties for a while there, because he was selling a lot of records. That was a top 10 song.
Yeah. Mailbox money is a beautiful thing.
It was like, oh my goodness, here's another. Oh my goodness, that's great. Yeah, and I've tried to get my songs into commercials and movies at times, and people have always expressed, oh, that's a great song, but I don't know. And then on its own, these songs happen, and Magnet and Steel was in a Toyota commercial right around the time that the Iraq War was about to start, when they were talking about bombing Baghdad. And so it was supposed to be in an ad. And every time I heard the word Baghdad, I separated into bagged ad, and that they were going to not use this commercial where they had taken my song Magnet and Steel. And it was a funny commercial about Sienna vans, Toyota Sienna vans, where the theme of it was, if kids ruled the world, and the little vignettes, if kids ruled the world, I'd eat all the 31 flavors of ice cream. Kids ruled the world, I'd have the Mexico wrestling team, and they had the guys with the masks in the van. And then the last one was this girl sitting in the back putting on headphones going, if kids ruled the world, I wouldn't have to listen to my parents singing Magnet and Steel again. And then the parents are in the front seat singing along with the song. It was kind of funny, but again, was a wonderful kind of boost in the economy of my life.
Well, I'll tell you, Walter, as you talk about that, you're listening to your new album. There's actually a track on there, Waking Up to You. As soon as I heard that intro, I thought, man, this song's going to wind up in a TV commercial or a show or movie or something.
Well, your lips to God's ear, as they say. That would be great. I wouldn't mind that at all.
Well, it's got a great feel to it that it catches your attention, but yet it's subtle, which is why I thought, man, this would really work as a great music bed.
Well, I hope that someone's paying attention to your well thought out thoughts here. Yeah.
Well, if anybody picks up on it, make sure you throw a couple of pennies my way.
Oh yeah, well, definitely. Yeah, Michael.
At least a lunch.
That was Michael Boswell's idea. But yeah, well, the way that album came together, that daughter of mine that I mentioned, she was about to move to LA, having graduated from high school and wanting to take a little brief break before going to college. And she came in one day and said, don't get the wrong idea, but I really do like this book. And it was a book called I'm With the Band, Pamela Des Barres' famous memoir of the groupie that she was. And I said, well, it's funny, I met Pamela at a Graham Parsons show, 10, 15 years ago. I think I'm even Facebook friends with her. So I got on Facebook, and sure enough, I was. I sent her a funny little note about my daughter saying that. And she said, well, I'm having a garage sale, a yard sale. You should come out when you come out to LA. So went out and visited her. And I had, my wife and I got divorced in 2004, and my wife was 11 years younger than I am. And so I always skewed myself younger than I am. And I would meet women my own age, and I was kind of like, ooh, I felt like they were of another generation for some reason. I can't help it, but that's the truth. Anyway, and Pamela happens to be, about 2 months younger than I am. And she's maintained herself quite well, I would have to say. She is quite an attractive woman. And so we sat around and talked about the music business and all of that when we were out there, and my daughter looked through her yard sale stuff. And it was like, well, how did I miss you? How did you miss me when I was being me? And she was like, well, that's the year that I was married and had my son. I was like, oh, okay. So that's why we never crossed paths back then. But yeah, and the songwriter in me kind of took over from there. And at the time I was going to LA maybe 4 or 5 times a year to do gigs with the Malibus, the reconstituted Malibus, my high school band. Because after I had success at Columbia, I kind of said, well, I'd like to do a record with my high school band and called the Malibus. And that eventually became the Rhino Malibu's Rule album. And then Johnny Z. Of course, it was his band in high school. And I said, this should be your band now anyway. I'll play with it and I'll be part of it, but this is your thing. Anyway, so once that got reinvented, so to speak, he's an active promoter of trying to make the legend of the Malibus even more legendary. So we've been doing shows opening for everybody from, Blue Oyster Cult to Herman's Hermits and everybody in between. And it's been fun. It's fun. We do shows at the Saban Theater in Beverly Hills. And, John doesn't want to do 5 sets a night in a club somewhere. He wants to be on the big stage. And so, we've been able to do those shows. So I was going out to town, out to LA a number of times. I was there. I lived there from 74 to 92. And then at that point, I had inherited the house I grew up in Queens. So I moved my family back there at that time. But through the years, I've been going out there regularly. So I was able to see Pamela on an off and on basis. I'd see her, 2 or 3 times if I was there for a week or whatever, And each of those kind of visits together inspired me to write more songs to try and encourage her to feel more like I was feeling about her. And so this album chronologically follows the path of that infatuation. It's wait, why aren't you reacting like that? And Waking Up to You, the one you mentioned, is kind of at the end of that arc where, if I can imagine the best way this could work out, this is how it would be. And it was kind of thinking about coming to visit her at her door one more time and realizing that, we're meant to be together kind of thing, which didn't work. But, and then the epilogue, those last 3 songs on that album were kind of after the fact. The cover I do of the Elvis song of Treat Me Nice, that's always been one of my favorite Elvis songs. And she's a big Elvis fan, and that was one of her favorites too. So I took on the challenge of trying to recreate the King. And I thought, it came out pretty well. And I was happy that, she liked the songs. And now she says, these are the best songs I've ever written. Talk to her. And, I think it's probably for the best that we didn't get together anyway. But this, songwriter's revenge, it's the ultimate transferring of your grief into a song and making it into something, Yeah. So I'm real happy about the album. I had given. Well, there's a guy in England, and his label is Red Steel Music. And back in the year 2000 or so, he released an album of mine, which kind of was the one after the Backstreet album that we recorded in the same milieu as those albums. But Greg Lewick and me, my manager, it's like, we're going to start the album. We'll get about halfway through and we'll sell it to a label and then we'll finish it. And that's the album that has Christine McVie. It has Jackson Browne. Chris Darrow is on that with me. Lindsey is on that. And it's, and even Randy California, because we skipped over the years that I played bass in Spirit, but that was another thing. But yeah, the Malibus were booked to play at the International Pop Overthrow, this movable festival that David Bash does.
Mm-hmm.
He was doing it in Liverpool at the Cavern Club. And so we went over there and did that show. And Robert Korich, who is the man behind Red Steel Music, came up and saw the shows. And I knew he was going to come. I brought a bunch of my CDs, home recordings and things, and I gave them to him. And that was a year before the quarantine, the lockdown and everything happened. And as that began a year ago, last March, I had a strange dream about him where in this dream, he had a helicopter, a red helicopter that was parked outside of his apartment, on the 10th floor of his building or whatever. It was just kind of suspended there and he could use it. And it was just this weird, funny dream. So I sent him a text saying, "Hey, how you doing? I had this strange dream. You don't have a helicopter, do you?" And it's like, no, but I've been listening to your CDs finally. And what's the Pamela album? I'd really like to, I think we should do something with it. It's great. And that's how it developed. And that was over the year of the quarantine. That was the carrot of the music biz that was dangling in front of me, that the illusion of still having a career. Because we really, all shows were stopped. I had been doing these shows. I'm kind of fortunate to have Magnet Steel having been a hit when it was, because now it is classed yacht rock, and which is the rebranding of mid 70s to kind of mid 80s smooth songs. I always just thought it was rock personally, but I was happy to be included in the club of the yacht rockers. And there's a band out of Atlanta called the Yacht Rock Review, who are a great cover band that has the genuine artists join them for these songs. And they do festivals. They do a show, Piedmont Park in Atlanta, in the midsummer, where they draw up to 5,000 people as a cover band. So I was happy to do some of their shows. And then 2019, I was offered a tour with this thing called Rock the Yacht. And it had Ambrosia as the house band, who have done amazing songs, and they are wonderfully talented. Then it was John Ford Coley, Stephen Bishop, Peter Beckett, the voice of Player, and myself mostly. And there might have been a different, and Elliot Lurie, of course, Brandy, You're a Fine Girl. And that was the package. And we did some great shows in the summer of 2019. And we're all set to do it again last summer. And that, of course, got suspended. And that's just being regenerated now. So looking forward to doing that some more. So, yeah, I'm happy to have been in that club, even though I think there is somewhere online, there's a listing of the most yacht rocky songs. And I think Christopher Cross and Ambrosia are up on the top of that one. And I think Magnet and Steel comes in around 54 as far as percentage of yacht rockness that this particular website seems to think. But yeah, I've been very lucky in so many ways. I just kind of happened to be in the right place at the right time, to have been doing those demos at Sound City. Who knew that was going to lead to being part of that whole Fleetwood Mac thing that was happening, because that was just before Rumors took off. Mm-hmm. And suddenly I was hanging out with my friends, and it was this, the crowds kept getting bigger and bigger, and it was like, wow, this is good. And then, in a way, it was curse and blessing, I suppose, because I was always kind of, the first question most people asked me was, what was Stevie really like? And that was kind of Well, okay. Did you listen to my music?
Do you not remember Hot Summer Nights?
It, but hey, in my experience, so many people who have been really talented and trying to make a life in the music biz have fallen by the wayside through frustration and things that never happen, or people that rip them off or whatever. And, just to be fortunate enough to make it to that point and to have a song that people remember 40 years later is quite amazing. And to be able to have a life in the music business, to be able to keep recording songs, and because I've done like 13 or 14 albums, depending on how you look at some of these re-releases and things. And at this point, I can only say that a week or so ago, I was talking to my ex-manager, Greg, about how Columbia, now Sony, has just decided that they were wrong thinking that all these artists hadn't been recouped yet. And so there's this whole new era supposedly starting with them. I think they're just doing that to head off so many people wanting to sue them for an auditing that they haven't really been taken care of. But there's also interest in either re-releasing those first couple of albums, kind of promoting other songs as singles out of that. So, I mean, that would be amazing if it happens, of course. And so I've always had a foot in each side of my life as far as that goes. I'm an active songwriter that wants my new songs to be heard, but I don't want to deny what's happened in the past, and especially when people seem to have such affection for it. So yeah, it's been that, and of course the quarantine also gave me a great opportunity to paint a lot. Now, I was an art major at Georgetown, and I've continued to create art through the years. I never quite got to be the metal sculptor that I kind of wanted to be as I was leaving college, because that was really fun to get in there with a welding torch and put together these massive steel things. But I've continued that, and I started painting again, mostly after I moved to New York in the early 90s, back to my old house where all my old art materials happened to be. And my stepfather, having been an artist himself, there were a lot of art supplies in the house. And so around that time, I had written a song called R&R.I.P. to recount the kind of pithy demise of the greats like Elvis and John Lennon and Janis. And so I started making pieces corresponding to that. Also, as I mentioned, I was raised a Catholic, and in Catholic church, they give you little cards with pictures of saints on them, and they're kind of holy cards, they call them. And so it occurred to me to make holy cards of the martyrs of rock and roll. And so I started making pictures and other pieces around that. And that continued on through, through the winter of my surgeries. I like to say I had open heart surgery in 2014 and a new hip a few months after that. I had an exhibit up in Georgetown of the martyrs of rock. And then that exhibit also happened on the West Coast at the Mr. Music Head Gallery later on in 2015. And so, I've got all these paintings. And if you go to Instagram, Walter Lindsey Egan on Instagram, that's where I put most of my paintings. And through the quarantine, I was painting a lot. I was doing a lot, and not necessarily all R&R.I.P. rock martyrs thing, but all kinds of paintings. And so that's, as your original question 3 hours ago pointed at, the diversity of creativity is, I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to do, because in my house, I can go from my studio room to where I'm making some new song, walk to the other side and pick up my paintbrush and work on that for a while. And I think it must be different parts of your brain that deals with these things, even though the right side of the brain is supposed to be the creative side. I think, isn't it? Or is it? I never can remember. It's like the Everly Brothers. I always go, now which Don, which is Phil? No, that's Eminem. Anyway, getting old is not that much fun, actually.
Well, beats the alternative.
Well, that's what they say. And I can imagine that's true. I like Stephen Wright's line. I plan on living forever. So far, so good.
He's brilliant.
He is. I love Stephen Wright. He's one of my favorites. So yeah, what else do you want to know?
Well, tell me this: what upcoming projects do you have on your schedule?
Well, I think there are maybe 2 or 3 albums at least in the can of the recordings that actually came after the Fascination recordings. I would love to work with Lindsey again, and Stevie, I suppose. That would be nice if something like that would happen. Robert has been talking about doing an album to correspond with the Martyrs of Rock paintings. So because actually when I did those exhibits, I would perform at the exhibit. The one in LA, Dean Torrance came and sang with me because there's a painting of Jan Berry that I did. And so, doing the songs of the Martyrs, I think would be a fun project.
Well, Dean had sung on a couple of your albums, hadn't he?
He did. And in fact, he was the art director on the Not Shy album as well. Dean's a good friend now, and he maintains his youthfulness, even though he's even older than I am, which is hard to believe. He's a great guy. And I plan on doing that and continuing the creativity that I've been living for a while now. I would love to promote some of these screenplays that I've written. Be nice to see if something could come of any of those. I have, many ideas that have yet to be hatched out of this fertile brain that I have here. So, but yeah, those are the things. And more specifically, September 18th, I'll be playing with my Walternative band at Kimbrough's in Franklin, Tennessee. If you're in the neighborhood, come on by. It's a great hang and a great place to be. I'm open to the world, and the world seems to be happy to come up with things for me to do and think about and see as I move along. So, yeah, I wish I had more specific ideas for you. I've got August 2nd, I have a colonoscopy scheduled. So if you're in the Cool Springs area, come on by.
Step up by. No live streaming, though.
That's
all right. Well, tell you what, Walter, I think we covered things pretty thoroughly.
I hope so. I think we did.
So,
it's been a pleasure, Michael. I really appreciate your interest and the inspiration of seeing. Now, did you just put the Kingston Trio record up there just for me, or is that always there?
Well, no. You know what? We rotate it every episode. And what I'll try to do is do an album or an artist that is somehow pertinent to the guest.
Oh, good. So you knew that was coming. Okay, great.
So this way, it's a pleasant surprise. Sometimes we'll put something up just for fun, be totally unrelated in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
But
I can't figure out what that is over your head there. I can't really.
That's the logo for the show.
Oh, okay. So the Majestic. Tell me about the Majestic.
The Majestic is a historic theater in Kankakee, Illinois, say about 60 miles south of Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
that was built in like 1912, and throughout its time, the Marx Brothers had played there, Maurice Chevalier had played there, and that's where this show got its start.
Ooh la la. Well,
So,
I have a song called Heartbreak Kills that mentions the town Kankakee in it. It's kind of a song written around the sound of words. It's peripatetic, as they say. It travels around, and woke up in a coma in a home in Oklahoma. Felt like I was still in a dream. From a car lot in Charlotte, I was hidden by a harlot in a facile castle in Queens. I was broke in Hoboken when I heard the words spoken by a Yankee on a train to Kankakee.
now, how did you come to know Kankakee? Was it from
I
Steve
love
Goodman?
geography. When I was a kid, my room was a very small room in the house in Forest Hills, and we made National Geographic maps as the wallpaper. My parents put that. So I used to lay there in bed and I would stare at the maps and I would imagine myself going places. I always wanted to go places. When I got my driver's license, what I used to do was drive to Idlewild, as it used to be called, Airport, JFK. And this is way before selfies, I would take my little Instamatic and take pictures of myself in front of like the TWA, the amazing TWA terminal and the Pan Am terminal, imagining that I was traveling somewhere. It's funny. That's a memory that I just remembered recently. And so I had that kind of traveling bug from the beginning, and of course, the beauty of being a musician is you get paid to travel.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, maybe one of these days you'll come through Kankakee.
I hope so. I intend it. I intend on, the Fascination album first came out in England basically in February, and so it's just getting its launch here stateside. And I'm hoping as things open up, I'll be able to follow that through. In fact, I am playing in Ohio tentatively in Warren and Lorain, Ohio. I think it's the 21st, 22nd, 23rd with Bo Donaldson and Maxine Nightingale, and it's supposed to be Norman Greenbaum. And I think maybe Elliot Lurie is on that show as well. So I'm getting there. I'm moving out. It's moving up. So yeah, Kankakee, I'll put it on my list.
There you go. Let's do a show at the Majestic.
I would love to do that. It would be perfect after this, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Excellent.
We'll have to figure out a way to make it happen.
Let's do that. Very good. Well, again,
all right,
thank you, Michael, I appreciate your interest, and it's been fun talking to you.
No problem. I say, you've had such an interesting career, and the new album, Fascination, I really like it. I like the fact that, Miss Pamela rocks. Then you've got other songs where it's sounds like a song that would have been great if you would have had Tom Petty, on it with you.
Well,
so
it's a shame about Tom, but kind of the highlight of my 1978 touring schedule was a 2-week tour with him, where he was still trying to break through the top 40 market, and I was still trying to break through the album market. So we would swap headlining night after night, and that was really fun for me, and I think there's a lot to be said of what that our music is very similar, Tom's and mine. I think we're both rockers at heart, and so yeah, it would have been nice to have Tom on some of those,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what, Walter, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up here. Throughout the show, we've had your website and your social media. As you mentioned, the paintings that you discussed, those are posted on your Instagram page, account, whatever you want to call it, and so folks can see those there. In the meantime, I want to thank everybody for watching. Walter, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Everybody have a good night.
All right, Michael, take care of yourself.
This has been Music Night at the Majestic. with Michael Boswell. If you enjoyed this edition of Music Night at the Majestic, follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and at musicnight.net. Music Night at the Majestic is a copyright production of Starliner Media. Any use of the accounts and descriptions of this program, its audio or visual content, without the express written consent of Starliner Media is prohibited. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll see you next time for Music Night at the Majestic. This is your announcer speaking. Starliner Media.